Um, Guys, I'm excited to have time with you. I'm really honored to be here. Just even over the last couple of months, having time with YWAM and YWAM leaders has honestly been one of the greatest joys of COVID for me. And so I feel it a real privilege. And I'll tell you, I know we don't have long together right now. It's a short session and you're already on your sixth. So I can imagine you're pretty full on information. But what I would like to do is really just maybe talk with you for about 20 minutes or so about some things I have deep conviction about, centered around YWAM local church and this whole issue around sending students back into the local church, debriefing, and how to actually send people into that place. And then, but so that we can have some space and time for some questions, because I think that's going to be a helpful part of learning together, as well as having the chance to kind of process this. And I do come from a unique perspective in the sense that, I did YWAM myself, not only in a DTS and an SBS, but did also staff in DTS for a short season. Now, since 2006, have been teaching regularly at YWAM bases kind of around the world, and just consider it a real joy and honor. It is to be trusted in YWAM is not something I take lightly. I love and honor YWAM. I am a product of YWAM. My life was rescued by YWAM. I am indebted to YWAM. So the chance that I get the honor to come and serve in any way means a great deal to me. So I think very highly of you. I think very highly of what you do. And some of you might have heard me teach before, and primarily where I'm getting asked to teach in YWAM and in other places in local church contexts is around the issues of understanding secular culture, secularism, postmodernism, metamodernism, pluralism, and these issues, critical race theory, secular humanism, and how they're shaping our worldviews. And what you're going to find, and I don't obviously have the ability to dive into those subjects in this moment in the way, but I would tell you that one of the most important things you can do in both the discipleship of the students that are coming to you, but the transition of how to see them flourish after their time with you, is understanding the forces of cultural worldviews that we're facing and how much they're impacting you. And I think the best way I could describe it to you is everybody you know is being discipled by ghosts, and they are shaping them more than you could ever imagine. They are influencing them more than you can imagine, and everybody feels it, but nobody can name it. And the power of what happens when you can name what people are going through, show them the truth of the kingdom, and give them an alternative, the counterculture of Jesus. You invite them into a radical rescue that I believe deeply matters. Now, in that, before I started being asked to kind of teach on cultural worldview, and that's kind of honestly pretty much the only thing that I travel and speak on now when it comes to YWAM, just because it's such a felt need, was for about 6 years, I did debrief weeks for a lot of YWAM bases. And part of that is because of my unique experience of both being in YWAM personally, now being a local church pastor, but then especially in the season when I was a youth and college pastor. I'm a senior pastor now, but when I was a youth and college pastor, I was sending a lot of young people into YWAM and receiving a lot of young people back from YWAM. And it really helped me discern and understand some things. And I just want to give you a couple of high-level thoughts that I think are incredibly important. If I have whatever trust I have with you, I ask you to hear me on this, because I actually think the way people are being sent out of YWAM is actually maybe one of the most important things you are doing for them and with them. And I would tell you, I don't say this out of judgment or a sense of critique. I am concerned with how little YWAM values their debrief week in general. And if I could have any authority over YWAM, not that I'm looking for it or deserve it, but if I could suddenly place myself as the Pope of YWAM and have everybody's ear and trust, I would tell you that your debrief week is far more important than you think it is, that what you do in it is far more important than what you understand, and you are setting students up for really difficult circumstances if you are not honoring and prioritizing what needs to happen in the debrief week. Let me kind of unpack that for a little bit, and then we can talk through that. So first, let me start with this. I don't think we understand well as missionaries in general, especially when it comes to short-term missions, the culture shock that students go through on the end of their DTS. First, they're going to go through physical culture shock. You're basically in a unique enough experience for long enough that every student that you're going to run through a discipleship program is going to experience some form of physical culture shock. It's biological, it's natural, it's always what happens. If you're in a country for probably more than 5 to 6 weeks, you're entering into the space. This is what just the research tells us. You're entering into the space where culture shock becomes real. I mean, students experience this when they're in a cross-cultural experience, whether they're going to a student abroad, whether you do a missions trip, whatever the case may be. If you are in the engagement of settling into a culture that is not your home culture, you are going to experience a level of culture shock. And I think a lot of times this isn't understood, and it's also neglected in what students are going to experience on the other side of DTS. And I would tell you it's a double culture shock, because a lot of people are both going to have culture shock from their experience of leaving their YWAM base where they did their discipleship training, and also a level of culture shock from whatever nation they just went and did their outreach in. And especially for a student who's, let's just think about a European student who's coming to an American YWAM base, who's then going to an Asian country for their outreach experience, or an American student who's going to Australia for their discipleship and then going to Europe for their, I mean, it doesn't matter what scenario you put it in, you kind of track with me. Even an American going to an American base, we all know there's such a culture within YWAM. This is what we're proud of. There's a beautiful culture within YWAM. Leaving it is painful. So not only are you experiencing culture shock from your YWAM discipleship experience, you're experiencing culture shock from your outreach experience, you're also experiencing spiritual culture shock, because for most students, they are leaving the most profound spiritual family they've ever engaged in. And the cost of leaving that is really, really, really hard. Harder than you know, and harder than we can honestly understand, especially for us that are a little bit older than Generation Z or current students, because of the framework of what they're coming out of. And there's a lot you can do to learn on culture shock. I encourage you, it needs to be something you're familiar with. And basically there's a lot of different language and words around it, but they all come back to the same idea. Culture shock, it runs in this idea of disengagement, euphoria, alienation, and gradual readjustment. These 4 stages that kind of happen in the midst of culture shock. And why we have to understand this is because what I'm telling you is that to some level, all of the students you send home from DTS are going to walk through a season called alienation. And what happens in alienation is alienation lies to you. Alienation tells you what you experienced wasn't real. Alienation tells you all the victory you gained wasn't real. Alienation tells you you're not really loved. Alienation has this powerful effect of what it does. It disorients you. And when it disorients you, you don't know what you can trust, and you don't know how to actually hold the experience you just had. And so there are so many people. I mean, I can name my own students who went through YWAM. I'm sure you have people that you've sent out, and 5 years later, they're not following Jesus. I'm not saying that's all our responsibility, but to act as if the culture shock stage following DTS isn't a part of that would be naive. I believe it is a part of that. And I think what happens is so many people post their DTS experience because they don't have language for what they're walking through. They don't have guidance for what they're walking through. Alienation lies to them. And to try to balance their disorientation, they end up moving towards things that are dangerous to them, dangerous to their faith, and can really hurt them. And so the first thing that I would tell you is that there needs to be an understanding of what students are about to experience. Leaving your DTS is hard. It's really hard. And we can accept that, be critical about that. We can push back on it. But I'll tell you, the statistics stand for themselves. It is very difficult for a student, especially the kind of students that are now coming into DTS, who are coming into DTS not from strong spiritual backgrounds, not from strong family backgrounds, not into strong Christian stories. They're coming back and they're really floundering, and we need to be aware of that. So what that means is that the whole point of debrief is not actually to find out whether they had a good experience. It's not to find out really whether they need to forgive somebody else who's on their discipleship team, which hopefully, if there's stuff that needs to be worked out. Actually, the whole point of debrief week is sending them home with tools that they're still going to be Christians a year from now. And that is what your debrief week needs to be. And that is what they're going to face. Are they going to hold on to their faith when they get crushed from every side? Not only just the reality of culture shock, the reality of needing to figure out how to follow Jesus apart from this profound spiritual community that they've just cultivated, apart from a deep mistrust of the local church. And then you just add in the reality of spiritual warfare that they are going to face in the midst of it. It's something that needs your guidance, and it's something that needs your care. So what I would offer to you is just a few thoughts. First, I think you need to understand this. Students are going to come into your DTS with a presumed distrust of the local church. Not everybody. I'm speaking in general ideas, but because this is the product of secularism within a generation. We tend to distrust more than we trust. We distrust authority. We distrust institution. And then often, because there are stories that can back that up, we spiritualize it without really having a robust biblical theology around it. And our theology looks like reaction more than it looks like Jesus. And I tell people all the time, when you make a theological decision out of reaction, your theological decision is wrong. Our theology is not based out of reaction. Our theology is based on the person of Jesus. And what you're reacting to may not be Jesus, but that oftentimes we countercorrect into false places. And I see that all of the time. And so what you have to understand is that you have a generation coming to you that is starting from a place of distrust in the local church. And I think actually the love and value of the local church needs to be an embedded part of the discipleship experience with your students. And that's not naive. I don't come to you just because I'm a local church pastor doesn't mean that I've come to, I have this idea that the local church is perfect and anyone who has a problem with the local church is wrong. Far from it. I'm very aware of the weaknesses of the body of Christ and the weaknesses that can happen within church context. But it's, I understand there's a lot of people on this call. We're all going to have different experiences and opinions. But I think it's safe to say that Jesus loves his bride. And if Jesus loves his bride, we must continue to contend to love his bride. You cannot love Jesus and hate the church. They're not compatible realities. We actually have to realize in the midst of the brokenness and the weakness of the church is the beloved of Jesus, and we can't hate Jesus' wife. It doesn't work. You don't get to love me and hate my wife. You don't get to love Jesus and hate his wife. We actually accept them together, and we have to come to that conclusion. You need to embed a conversation about the importance of the local church and the importance of spiritual community, the importance of accountability, the importance of spiritual friendships. These need to be things that are woven through your entire discipleship process, both in what you're doing in your DTS and in what you're doing in one-on-one discipleship. Thus, another problem, if this is going to be something that is embedded into the value of your students, it has to be embedded into the value of your staff. It doesn't work to be a staff member who hates the local church. If that's in you, you've just got to own it. And you've got to own that your feelings are worthy of care, but your conclusion is not biblical. And we have to come back to a biblical place. So part of this is to be a DTS staff member. You have to have a value for the local church. That doesn't mean you need to praise the local church. That doesn't mean you don't need to have opinions of the local church. You get to be you in the story. But if you have a staff member who basically think there's nothing valuable about the local church, then you're never going to be able to disciple your students into that either. So I think there's a genuine value. You've got to remember YWAM and its DTS was created in a distant world where people held cultural values that were assumed that people don't hold anymore. They don't hold anymore. So DTS needs to adjust to be able to speak to the values that are no longer in place. Second is this. So first you have to have an integrated value for the local church into the holistic vision of your DTS. It just has to happen. Number two, I would tell you that you need to integrate spiritual disciplines that translate anywhere into the life of your DTS. I still think one of the biggest mistakes I see of DTSs is you put too much priority on communal gatherings and not enough priority on teaching people how to be alone with Jesus. Now that I'm a big communal gathering guy. Like I love YWAM. I would love to worship every day with a community of people. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. It's beautiful and it's glorious and I love it. But what you need to remember is if you have 6 months, 5 months, if you have 5 months with a student, helping them value the spiritual disciplines that they can pick up and do anywhere. When they go to college and they're the only Christian on their dorm, have you taught them something that can work there? When you're sending them back home and none of their family are believers and none of their friends were believers, have you taught them spiritual disciplines that are going to translate that? Because you want to know what they're not going to have? They're not going to have a DTS staff member waking them up and they're not going to have a corporate time of worship. They're not going to have it. Even when you embed life into the local church, we all know local church is different. And so what we have to do is we have to prioritize teaching students to have a value for personal spiritual disciplines that can translate anywhere. That doesn't mean we don't celebrate what happens when we're together and we don't have a lot of common time of worship and prayer. It just means we have to have a new level of priority in helping them connect. So that's number two. Number three, so I'm just running through these and then we can go back and talk about them, right? Number three, and this kind of goes back to something I said in the introduction, we have to help people realize that when the fruit of secularism takes place inside of you, it displays itself in lack of trust. Now, I'm not saying that every person is trustworthy or that every institution is trustworthy, but I believe our default that things are not trustworthy, that churches are not trustworthy, that pastors are not trustworthy, that institutions are not trustworthy is not true. It's actually what secularism has taught us to believe. And so I actually think one of the things you have to do is you have to bring language to the lack of trust that's happening in people's lives. And when you do that, you help them become discerning of what's happening. So part of this, I would say, is there needs to be a focus on cultural worldviews within the training of your DTS and helping people be able to understand the forces that they're facing and therefore the fruit of those forces. Because when you can define that these things are happening in people's lives, they can resist them and be free from them rather than just simply setting them up to struggle for the rest of their life. So that was number three. Number four, I'm just kind of running through thoughts I've been praying over for you guys. Number four would be this. I would really encourage you to create a system of connection for students for 3 to 6 months after their DTS. I don't know how realistic it is to involve staff members in that because I understand that you finish with a DTS staff, you're exhausted, one. You need to care for yourself too. And then most likely you have responsibilities coming in a handful of weeks, 3, right? So where you can integrate staff into some post-DTS connection, that's really good. It also might not be realistic. But I think if you could create a spiritual reentry plan, a 3 to 6 month reentry plan that students are going to participate in, whether it's the discipleship group that you formed during your DTS, agreeing, covenanting together that they're going to follow through with each other for 6 more months. They're going to have a monthly meeting where they're going to check in with each other, where they're going to hold each other accountable. No, 99% of students, when they're leaving their DTS, don't want to walk away from Jesus. They want to be obedient. They want accountability. They want their friends. And helping them actually as part of their debrief week enter into some covenant with a handful of people. I am going to walk out life with you for the next 6 months. I am going to be accountable to you. I am going to let you speak into my life. I am going to let you challenge me. How to, connecting back to a local church, connecting back into some of these things that are really important in their lives. Because part of what culture shock is going to do, culture shock isolates you. There's how do you know when somebody's in the midst of culture shock? Because they withdraw in their alienation, and they push away people who can help them. So you need to recognize that students are going to naturally go through that. And as they're naturally going through that, you need to give them tools to combat that. So that's something that I think is really, really, really important. And then in your debrief week, so this would be my last thing, there's two really important things that you need to include into the process of their debrief. One would be how to go home with humility. What does it look like to go home with humility, or go into whatever they're going into with a profound sense of humility? And second, it would be just understanding that building trust within a local church just takes time. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. One of the really beautiful things about DTS is you have instant opportunity to express these things that God is doing inside of you. That is not true in a local church, nor should it be true in a local church, because we all know the error that happens when you put people in places of authority that have not proven that they're trustworthy with those places of authority. That's where people get really wounded. That's where really bad things happen. And it's an okay thing that in a local church context where you're not seeing somebody every single day, you're not eating every meal with them, you're not living 24/7 with them, that it's going to take a little bit longer for you to go, hey, can I, as a pastor, can I trust you with my teenagers? Can I trust you to lead a house church? Can I trust you with my children? Those are good questions that local church asks, and it's okay that takes more time than a DTS takes to establish that. So I think what we need to do is we need to help students go home with a sense of humility, but we also need to help students that know that it's going to take more time for them to get into a place of trusted leadership within a local church context. But once they do, they can absolutely flourish. And people who have been to YWAM, who come back with a spirit of humility and connect into local churches, thrive. They're game changers. They're incredible leaders. There's such a needed place for people with YWAM DNA. But I have often learned that YWAM students, because trust is instantaneous in a DTS context, they get bitter at the local church because it is not instantaneous in a local church context. But they do not understand how faulted of thinking that actually is. It's okay that growing into a leadership position at a local church takes time. And we need to help people understand that and not come to places of bitterness. I could say a lot more. I feel like I said a lot in that. So why don't we just let that stand and maybe ask some questions, and feel free to push back. Again, I come to you as a local church perspective. I honor that you are the DTS experts. I am not. I'm just trying to come to you with what I see happening, and what I am experiencing as I'm walking through life with students on the other side of DTS.
No, this is great. This is such good stuff. Thank you, Phil. Like we've been doing so far, guys, if you have questions, go ahead and stick them in the chat so we can see them and choose a few and talk through those. I know for me personally, I've got pages of notes here. This is so good. What do you guys got? What thoughts are rolling around? What kind of questions do you have? What are some implications to some of this that maybe there could be clarity on, or lead to follow up of some kind? Maybe I'll start with one while we give people a chance to type some things out. You mentioned giving language to lack of trust and to the distrust that exists. What does that look like? What is that language? What are the things we're saying and talking about?
Well, I think that one of the things that's happening, right, is that we're assuming that every time we have a lack of trust in someone or in something, that's a credible position. right? We're actually assuming our own sense of discernment of a lack of trust is credible. But what you begin to learn is actually this growing mistrust that's happening inside of people's hearts is actually because they're buying into beliefs of secularism. When you get it, there's a lot. This is a whole other conversation with a lot more time. But when you look at there are three main value points of secular humanism, which is only one aspect of secularism, but just as a clarity, as an example. You basically have the idea of radical individualism. You have the second concept of the death of transcendence. So there's nothing supernatural. And the third is the idea that you have to emancipate yourself from false ideologies. And that secular humanism would actually tell you that there are three main false ideologies that you have to emancipate yourself. The family, the state, and religion. All three of these things are trying to implement false governing control over you. And if you're going to find your own personal meaning and your own personal truth, you need to emancipate yourself from these systems and rename them and rediscover them for themselves. And what people don't understand is that actually a lot of times we're having a lack of faith in these things is actually because we can find connection points into secular belief systems. And what we don't realize is that the fruit of lack of trust is often not from personal experiences in our lives. It's often from ideologies that we've accepted that are counter to the nature of Jesus. And so what are the things that we need to do is we need to actually help people go back into their own lives and discover, using tools, using discipleship, using biblical understanding, helping them understand where they've bought into some of the lies of cultural worldviews that are producing this kind of fruit. Because actually, when you separate yourself from secularism, it's not that you believe everyone's golden and every church is perfect, but you actually find this trust begins to deeply grow inside of you, which is the way I believe we're supposed to design to function. So I don't know if that answers that for you, but I think it's a process of giving language to how much we've been affected by cultural worldviews. And I often tell people, I go, hey, do you actually know that lack of trust in church is an embedded value of secularism? It's not. This is coming from somewhere. A lack of trust in family, a lack of trust in these institutions are actually the fruits of a disposition. So let's go explore where you've given over to that disposition and see if it changes anything about your lack of trust.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. We got a couple of questions here. So one, YWAM Reno asks, what resources do you recommend for us to use for understanding secularism better?
Yeah, well, I would say there are many. If you kind of a book that is one that I would highly recommend, it's a little more dense and intellectual, but it's helpful. James K.A. Smith's book on how not to be secular. I would also highly recommend the podcast by Mark Sayers and John Mark Comer called This Cultural Moment as a kind of a different medium to engage with. Mark Sayers also writes a book called The Disappearing Church. I think that's really helpful. Ravi Zacharias wrote a book called, I think, Jesus Among Secular Gods. So there's a lot of resources available to you. In fact, Jen, I know that Jeremy West has several lectures that I've given on them. You could freely make those available to anyone who would want that might be helpful.
Yeah, great. We'll do that for sure. It looks like we got another question here. What is your recommendation on local church participation during the DTS?
It's hard. It's really hard. I don't think there's a perfect answer. So what I want to give you what I want to tell you is that the value of loving the local church is more going to be communicated through your discipleship than it is about forcing students to be a part of a local church during their DTS. I'm not saying that you should or shouldn't do that. I just recognize it's difficult. I also recognize, I often tell people, like, I understand the YWAM has a high value of it's not a local church, but I would tell you, in a lot of ways, you function in certain ways as a local church. And you need to actually understand the ways you do that, because I think when YWAM says, hey, we're not a local church, but then has a ton of local church expectations on its staff members, it actually robs people from giving those things to their local church, which actually require you to have intimacy with it. So I would say YWAM bases in general would do a really great job of clarifying that within themselves, of either saying, hey, we have some expectations on our staff members that they need to place into their local church, so we need to free them a little bit. Or we just need to admit, hey, there are parts of how we function in spiritual, because we are a spiritual community. YWAM is a spiritual community. It is not the same thing as a local church spiritual community, but there is deep overlap there. And I think the more YWAM bases could honor that, they could actually bring language to that, they could help people with that, the more you're going to empower people. Like so I was at YWAM Kona recently, and I basically was with some staff members where what I told them was, the problem is you're telling people that they need a local church, but then you're doing everything for them that a local church should be doing. And so you're expecting them to double up on things that only happen or that are supposed to happen in the local church, and you're actually setting them up to fail, because then you have to fake it and it's manufactured. And who likes church that is fake and manufactured? Nobody, right? And so YWAM, I would encourage, I know these are harder conversations, but I would say if a YWAM base wants to have a high value of the local church, clarity, pulling back a little bit, and where you're going to lean in, own it, and then help students understand how that, or staff understand how that's going to affect their life with a local church. So I would say, I think going to church in your DTS is helpful. I wouldn't discourage you from doing it, but students aren't going to learn that value of the local church from that experience. They're going to learn it from your discipleship.
That's good. That's really good. Would you be able to tell us, Phil, in your experience, what is one thing that often YWAM owns and then expects people to double up on in the function of their local church? What is one of those things?
Yeah, intimate spiritual relationships. Listen, if YWAM is going to be all of your intimate spiritual relationships, you will never thrive at a local church. You just won't. Church is an extension of some form of intimate spiritual relationships, a common group of people that you are on mission with in the name of Jesus in covenant community. So I'm not saying, hear me, I want to enter into the tension with you. I'm not saying you shouldn't have intimate spiritual relationships in YWAM. Yes, you should, absolutely. But if you have an expectation that people should be a part of their local churches, which I think is a great expectation, then you have to allow them to also have deep spiritual relationships in their local church and not simply at their YWAM base. And I find that most YWAM bases have such high expectations of forming spiritual relationships within YWAM. Not a bad thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It just often we haven't thought through the way it affects you other places. And I would encourage YWAM bases to go, okay, what do I want for my staff? I would think about staff, not students. What do I want for my staff in relationship to a local church? And what can I then cultivate to help them have that experience? Is that helpful?
Yes, that's very, very good. I just one thing I would add too is we find at our location, maybe you guys do as well, is oftentimes this gap or tension starts to exist when they've done our DTS and then come on staff. And we feel two things. One is we were their everything and their only in DTS. So they join staff and all of a sudden the experience is a failure. It doesn't meet their needs. It's not what DTS was. Helping, I love the way you used the phrase giving language to. I think for us as YWAMers, we've got to give language to the difference between even a DTS as a unique one-off season and the continued function as a believer in partnership with a community like YWAM and the other things that has to integrate. But then also we also battle on the other side where they find these amazing relationships in their churches and get plugged in and start working there and doing all the programs. And all of a sudden I'm like, wait a second, I thought you were a YWAMer.
Yeah.
So I hear that. I hear that tension. And I think probably all of us fall on one end of that particular pendulum swing for sure.
Right. Yeah, I actually think the greatest thing that a YWAM base could do to want to cultivate healthy perspectives towards a local church is really everything that's centered around their staff. Everything that's centered around their staff. I think yeah, DTS is a unique immersion discipleship season that is meant to give you a set of tools that will translate into the rest of your life. It's not set to be a prototype that defines the rest of your life. And the problem is, here's the problem, and I don't have a perfect answer to this problem. Often DTS staff members to run DTSs have to in some way augment their life into this temporary reality. And this is why DTS staff can easily get burned out or those kind of experiences. So the more that a YWAM base can do that actually allows DTS staff members to cultivate long-term relationships in a local church context, not only do I think they will actually bless and help their DTS staff, I think they'll create an environment that looks healthy for DTS students.
And this could answer our question to retention. We're constantly asking as well. So this is really good. We have a couple more questions. It looks like we have one question from Salem saying, I'll summarize it, but essentially, if the staff get that debrief is important, how do you help the students get that it's important so they really engage and hear you and try to be prepared?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, when I teach when I haven't taught debrief for several years, but when I was teaching it consistently, basically the very first thing I would say to students was your DTS ends at the end of this week. It doesn't end today. I beg you to give me attention because I'm here to actually rescue your faith, because statistics would say 30 to 50% of you aren't going to follow Jesus in a year, which is kind of when people have done research on post-DTS life, tends to be where people land. I've heard statistics from Kona, from Montana, and we're seeing that a significant amount of people who go through DTS. And again, I don't put any blame on DTS or on YWAM for that. I think that's a false place to put that blame. I think people are deeply benefited from going through DTS. But I try to capture people's attention of saying you're about to walk through hell, because they are. As a pastor, let me just tell you, I know very few people who thrive the 6 to 9 months after their DTS. Even the mature ones, even the ones who keep following Jesus, they go through crap. It is hard. They do not know which way is up or down. They feel useless. They feel like they cannot integrate their skills. They feel like everything they loved about YWAM, they can't find in the local church. They miss their friends. They just want to get deeply involved. They work is boring and it sucks and they can't find meaning in it. And whereas Jesus, and it was so easy to prophesy in YWAM, why is it so hard to prophesy? You know what I mean? Like, it's hard. It is hard. And I would say what you have to do is capture their attention. They are about to go to war. And for this 1 week, if you trust me, I'm here to give you tools to win that war. That is how well that's worked. You know, the only time will tell, but that's at least what I try to do.
That's great. And maybe that segues well into another question that is, in your experience doing debriefs, what is an ideal amount of time? Some bases in this exact forum have 0 days. Some have 3 days. Some have 10 days. Some do several weeks of lecture afterwards.
Yeah, so I'll give you my experiences in being invited to bases that have 1 week of debrief. And I've told this to Jeremy several times. I said, if it was up to me, debrief would be 2 to 3 weeks long. That's what I would think. Is that realistic? Again, believe me, I understand all of us as leaders have to balance what's best and what's real, right? And DTS are so fried. DTS staff are so fried after outreach. That is a hard expectation on DTS staff, to expect them to be still fully engaged. I would say zero. I would beg you to not have 0 days. I would beg you to not do debrief while you're still overseas. I think you have to be back home. I think you have to have priority around it. I think it has to be not about debriefing your actual experience more than it needs to be about sending people into what's next. I would encourage anyone to just think very seriously about it, and I understand the limitations you have. I think if it was up to me, I would try a 2 week debrief, and I would test the fruit of it. And if the fruit of it wasn't good, I would roll it back to 1 week. But I don't think I would do less than 1 week.
Yeah, that's great. That's really great. As a local pastor, what are you guys encouraging people to do to retain connection and those deep spiritual relationships with limitations and being able to meet?
During COVID specifically?
Yeah, I think that's probably what the context is of that
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us are feeling it, and so our church has a structure we call missional communities. It's a form is you know it's a house church small group formation of elements, and we have like 28 of them, something like that. And so I mean, we have fought for people to stay connected into their house churches, and whether that's digital, whether that's in person, we just basically said, hey, listen, we've got to, everybody's going to have different comfort levels. But we have really fought for people to stay connected through small groups and through small group structures and through what we do in the house church structure. So that has been where we've tried to live. And I think, everybody has different opinions about COVID, about face masks, about what we should be doing, what we shouldn't be doing. I would tell you my greatest encouragement is from everything I can tell, COVID is not a conspiracy. So I don't think we should be treating it as a conspiracy. But I also think people need spiritual gatherings and they need spiritual nourishment. And so we have to find the tipping point between those two worlds. And we need to honor as much as possible about what COVID's doing. I mean, I'll just tell you, I know several churches in my community that have had several people die from COVID. Atlanta's been a hot spot, obviously, so you feel it in the cities more than you feel it other places. I'd say 60 people in our church have gotten COVID. A ton of them were fine. A few of them got really sick. Several of them went on ventilators. So I'm just telling you from my experience, what we're seeing is that taking care and caution for COVID is not a foolish thing. It's not a foolish thing. It's something that, especially in a city and in an urban context, we have tried our best to manage. But people need people. There is power to meeting together, and the gospel is life on life. Church is life on life. Discipleship is life on life. No technology can replace what God designed and intended. And we have to have a high value for in-person gatherings, in-person community, and in-person discipleship, even in the midst of needing to keep people safe. So you hear me at least take an attempt at a very middle road on this. That's fine where you disagree with me, but I would encourage you to honor well and to fight for in-person gatherings where you can.
That's good. That's really good. We've just got one more question, and then we'll call it good for this session. But any particular insight on debriefing families?
Yeah, I find that families do better than other people, so that's good news. Certainly, one thing that I've learned about culture shock is the more transient in your life, the more you experience it, right? So like a DTS student who knows exactly what they're doing after their DTS, whether that's going back on DTS staff, whether that's going into a secondary school like a school of biblical studies, whether that they're going to college, they know exactly what college they're going to. A DTS student who has a concrete plan, which is not many, I understand that, but those that do tend to walk through culture shock better. Those that are married walk through it better than those who aren't. Those that have families, and because really it's about, again, culture shock disorients you and it lies to you. So where you have anchor points, you're going to walk through culture shock better. So the more anchor points you have, concrete plans, marriage, children, those are just, not saying those people who have those things are more mature. That's not true. But but they're more anchoring. You have things you're anchored into. And so those people tend to not be as deeply affected by culture shock. So really the ones who get it the most are singles who don't have a plan after DTS. Those are the ones who are most, have the most possible danger from what culture shock can do in their life.
Yeah, wow, that's really insightful. Thank you. Thank you, Phil, for joining us. I appreciate it. It was great to get to hear you again.
Yeah, I'm really honored to be with you guys, and I hope it's helpful. I know it's just some quick thoughts, but again,
so
let me just close by telling you I'm so thankful for you, and don't lose heart. And man, we live. Listen, I have deep concern about what's happening in our country as an American. I know not everybody here is an American, but I have deep concern about what's happening in our country as an American. I have deep concern for what's happening globally in the world. And I don't believe it's going to get better quicker. I actually think we're in for some really dark and hard seasons. And it's just I don't know if what I feel is prophetic discernment about what will be, or just pastoral concern about what could be. But I admit a warning in my spirit I cannot deny. And it is a season to strengthen ourselves in the Lord. It's a season to trust him. And it's a season to walk faithfully and walk faithfully with each other. So I just encourage you to not lose heart, to strengthen yourself in the Lord, and to be ready as for those who are in the American context, to be ready for a really, really painful year and a very painful November, and the ability to stay missionaries, kingdom-minded missionaries in the middle of it. If I could encourage you with anything, it's Mark 8. There is a spirit of Herod, there is a spirit of a Pharisee, and then there is Jesus. And he will always be the third option. And this is a season where we must not fall into the trap of the spirit of the world. We must not fall into the trap of the spirit of the Pharisee. And we must stay faithful to the person of Jesus, who is kingdom, who is a missionary, and who loves even his enemies. And we must continue to walk in his way. So I love you guys. God bless you.
Amen. Thank you so much.
Yep.
All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and transition here. We have about 10 minutes, and our next spot is Mr. Danny Lehman will be joining us to talk about discipleship. So get some water, use the restroom, close your eyes for a few minutes, whatever you got to do, and then we'll keep chugging along.